we have, again, the last few weeks we've become a little more interactive, and that's kind of my goal, to continue that trend. We've been looking at Jesus and stepping into the last week before Jesus' betrayal and arrest and crucifixion and resurrection and all of that, kind of working through some of his conversations with people, in particular with the crowds, with his followers, and with some of the religious and political leaders in Jerusalem at the time. And it's like Jesus' kingdom operates in a totally different way and direction than human nature operates. And all of that's being contrasted and sometimes creating some conflict between people and between Jesus, because his direction and his way of thinking, God's way of thinking, is just so polar opposite to the way that we interact as humans sometimes. And I want to start off just with a question for you all, and I'd love some input on this. What is the darkest place that you've ever been in your life? I'm not necessarily talking about like emotionally, but physically, a place that was dark that you were in. Yes?
Homeless on the streets of Phoenix and my addictions.
Okay, so, and that, again, that's bridging the gap into like all these types of emotion experiences. He said, homeless on the streets in the midst of addiction. That's a very dark place. Sure. Yeah. What about others of you? Dark places that you've been? Yes?
Alcatraz in their solitary confinement.
Alcatraz. Seeing what the solitary confinement there was like. Interesting. Yes?
When I had COVID the first time.
When you had COVID and it was very serious. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yes? In the mines in Cooper Pedy, Australia. Deep down.
After they mined the opals, they put a motel in.
Okay, interesting. So they had an opal mine that was converted to a motel. Huh. And the generators went off. Oh, man. That sounds like a dark experience. June, did you have something as well?
Before I knew the Lord about 25 years ago, and I thought I was a religious person, but I was just that, a religious person.
Okay, and again, that's when you get into like spiritually, you realize, at that point in time, I didn't see. And the reason why I ask that is because we are going to encounter the word blind or blindness a lot, or dark, as well. That's kind of a synonym, I guess, in some ways, also in this conversation with Jesus. I would say one of the darkest places that I've ever been in life was kind of similar to what Don's experience was with this mine, but it was deep within a cave. And I've been in different cave systems before where either I was with a group of friends and it wasn't one of those professional, come up and tour the cave because we have lights everywhere. It was one that you explore on your own. And so deep down, underground, room after room, you get to a point, and when, especially myself, when I'm with friends, I get curious, what would it be like if we all turned our flashlights off? And it's so dark, you can't even see your finger an inch in front of your face. And it's complete darkness. I was reading stories about some of the first people that tried to map caves, and there was one gentleman who, this was back, I think in, 1679, I believe, is when it was, 1672. There was an explorer, and he was in Slovenia, and he was trying to create one of the first maps of a cave system. And he spent several hours wandering the passages of this cave, and he had calculated that he had gone approximately 6 miles. And he drew out the cave plan. And then when he finally came out of the cave, and later on, years and years, I think it was years later before they realized the size of this cave. But he had actually been wandering over a distance of only 1,500 feet. And he was so disoriented because of the darkness. And can you imagine somebody like that? They're trying to make a map so other people can follow it. And that's kind of what we're encountering today in this passage. Some of the religious leaders, they think they know the way and the direction, and they're creating the map for how to live life. And at the same time, they themselves, there's a lot that they don't understand. And so Jesus actually calls them blind guides a few places in today's conversation, because they're trying to assume a position of leadership and showing people what life with God is like. But they've just been wandering around, and they think they have all of these things figured out, but they've been confined in such a small space. So that's what we're going to encounter today in this passage. We're in Matthew 23, verses 16 through about 28 today for our conversation. Last week, just for a recap, Jesus is commenting to the crowds, commenting to his followers, and then perhaps to some of the scribes, Pharisees, and other religious and political leaders who happen to be present or within earshot of his conversation, talking about how the instructors in Israel themselves are so inconsistent. They're trying to teach people things, but they're not willing to live out the very things that they're teaching, or those teachings are really inconsistent with God's way of living in the first place. And so last week we talked about a few different areas of inconsistency. We talked about their actions, because their religious leaders were great at putting heavy demands and burdens on the people. Live up to all these traditions and all these rituals and live perfectly in all these ways. But at the same time, they weren't willing to live out the same things they were telling other people to do. On another aspect of that, they were motivated by attention, by approval of people, and they were constantly looking for opportunities to put themselves above other people around them. And if you know the way Jesus lives and he operates, it's the polar opposite of that. They wanted exaltation and attention. And they were the leaders, supposedly spiritual leaders, setting the example for everybody else. And then they were trying to bring people into a kingdom, but it was a very different kingdom than what Jesus set out for. Last week we used that illustration with Disneyland, with the person who's trying to only allow the most committed people, the biggest Disney fans into Disneyland. And if you don't own Disney stock and, you don't have all the movies memorized and all these things, you're not good enough to go and enjoy Disneyland. But that would ruin the experience, and that was the religious climate that these people were creating. If you want to be a follower of God, you have to be so rigid and follow all these rules and laws perfectly. Otherwise, you're not good enough for God. And Jesus had a totally polar opposite viewpoint. So he's pointing out those inconsistencies. And today we're going to encounter a few more inconsistencies with what the religious teachers of Jesus' day were teaching and what God really thinks about life. And maybe that'll reveal some things to us, because certainly, we've heard some things today. Maybe it's things that you've even gathered from different religious teachers or church experiences in your own life. But it just doesn't seem like those things match up with the way that Jesus tells us to live life, this abundant, full life. And maybe it doesn't match up. Maybe there's some inconsistencies that are good for us to recognize as well. So we're going to see a few different aspects today. The first category we're going to look at is truthfulness. Do you think truthfulness is kind of maybe important for somebody who's leading other people, guiding other people into what life is about? Perhaps. And we get into a context, and I want to just briefly set the historical and kind of cultural context for this. In first century Judaism, Jewish people take oaths. And there's two different kinds of oaths that they make, and they've made kind of throughout their religious history ever since the time of Moses. Oaths or promises or commitments were mentioned in the law of Moses in the Old Testament, and that's been kind of a trend throughout Jewish culture. We might take oaths today in a courtroom. That's kind of how we see it, but we make promises, but we don't take formal vows or oaths or things like that. But there are two kinds in their culture at this point in time, and that's going to play out in just a moment into our understanding of what's going on. The first kind are called oaths of utterances, and those are related to the purpose of worship. And so you're going to make a promise to probably God in most cases, to follow one of his commands, or to avoid certain things that you need to avoid, or to give up something like your resources to help somebody else, or maybe you're going to deprive yourself of something like food for the purpose of fasting. But in Jewish society, it was very common for them to make these formal promises. God, I will do this to you. And they wouldn't just make it privately before God like we would, they would make it kind of publicly. So it's a public announcement that other people are aware of. The other kinds of things that people would make oaths about were oaths of testimony. And those were witness statements in court, kind of similar to what we would do in a court of law today, but their court systems were structured differently. And so it might be a group of religious leaders or people from the city that are making a decision, or somebody from the Roman Empire that's making a decision, and they're giving testimony. So they're going to make an oath or a promise that they're going to give correct, witness in regard to something like abuse that they've encountered or experienced, or theft, or humiliation, or injury that they or someone else has experienced, because they're a witness, or fraud, or any of those kinds of things. And so they're going to give testimony. And as people would make these two different kinds of oaths, they would name certain objects, important objects, as they made those commitments. I make my oath upon the temple in Jerusalem, or I make my oath upon, my ancestor who is very cherished, or I make my oath upon the synagogue, or I make my oath upon the altar of sacrifice in the temple. And so they would name something to prove that they're serious. And you might hear people do something like this, maybe not commonly, but like, on my mother's grave, I swear that, or whatever. And so they're saying like, okay, I'm serious, because, my mom, I care about my mom, and she's passed on now. And so like, this is to show that I'm serious. So they would do the same things. But the religious leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, who we've been talking about the last few weeks, they have decided in their culture that certain objects are not great enough to obligate you to follow through with your commitment, or to obligate you to tell the truth in court. And so if you didn't choose a valuable enough object and you made your promise or your oath for your testimony, you can actually get out of it, or you can say something false and it can't be held against you. Can you imagine how that would play out? Let's say you make a promise to somebody and you know there's a way of getting out of it. What does human tendency lead you toward? For example, let's say tonight after church, my kids aren't in the room so I can safely say this. Let's say I promise them, hey kids, tonight we're going to go to Dairy Queen. We're going to get some ice cream after dinner tonight. And then it comes to be about 6 or 6:30 and I say, you know kids, I wasn't really serious about that. When I promised that to you, I had my fingers crossed behind my back. So because I promised it, I don't have to keep that promise now because my fingers were crossed. If I had pinky promised to you, then I would be held accountable to it. But since I had my fingers crossed, it doesn't count anymore. How would they react to that?
They lose their trust.
Yeah, right? They lose their trust of me because I'm not trustworthy, I'm not reliable anymore. Think about a court of law. What if you gave testimony and you said, you know, I swear on this thing or whatever, and then you gave something false, and somebody said, well, you know, you didn't put your hand on the Bible, so that's okay. What would that do in a court of law if you just gave false testimony and thought it was okay because you didn't swear on an important enough object?
Get you elected.
Okay. Okay, so Dave is saying, oh, maybe some political benefits there. I don't know. That's a deep hole. So, what would happen in court? What would happen to justice in the legal system if you could never trust somebody's testimony?
Already happened.
Okay, maybe it is. What would happen to people who were on trial?
Innocents could go to jail.
Yeah, like innocent could go to jail, guilty could go free. People would ultimately say, well, the courts are a joke. I can do whatever I want. There's no consequences because I can just say, well, that testimony wasn't valid because of ABC, right?
They actually do that in the Middle East in certain tribunals.
And maybe there are places in the world where those types of things are experienced. I don't know. I have a lot of personal knowledge of that. But and then, you know, as we said, with our kids and in our families, with our commitments to God, obviously, like you don't know who or what you can trust. You don't know if you can trust anything that somebody says. And so that's the end result of something like that. You have people who are freely, you know, they're lying now, and injustice is happening. And my kids are disappointed because I had my fingers crossed. And as people get more and more disappointed, people get bitter, right? And so there's all these different types of results and consequences that flow out of that. And Jesus is about ready to point out that kind of odd and very misleading logic that we just talked about. This is what he says in verse 16 as we get into our passage today in this conversation. He says, woe to you. And again, that word woe for us, it seems like, you know, a term of condemnation. But in this culture, the word woe, it's really a term of grief. And so Jesus is looking at how these religious leaders are living life and how they're directing people, and it really breaks his heart because he knows how misleading it is. And so he's grieving over what's happening here because he sees it face to face. Woe to you, blind guides. So again, you people that you're kind of in darkness. You think you know the direction, but you've got the cave mapped all wrong as far as how to live life with God. You ones who say, whoever takes an oath by the temple, it means nothing, but whoever takes an oath by the gold of the temple, now that person's bound by their oath. So that was one of the discrepancies. If you swear on the temple, like, you know, it doesn't count. But if you swear on the gold of the temple that's collected for the offering, now that's serious. And there are pages and pages and pages of conversations that happen. About 200 years later, there's a Jewish document called the Mishnah, where a lot of these rabbis' conversations from the 1st and 2nd century around the time of Jesus and slightly thereafter, they're recorded. And there are people going back and forth about what things are important enough to make a valid oath and what things aren't, and what things you have to swear oaths on. I mean, pages and pages and pages of these conversations. I'll share just a brief little clip from that in just a moment. But he says, blind fools, what's greater, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold in the first place? So really in their hearts, money seems to outweigh this place where in the Jewish mind, heaven and earth meet. It's like God's place where he came down and heaven and earth can meet and worship can happen there. And it's this huge experience of people being united again with God. And they're just focused on how the gold is so much more important than that place. So what does it say about their hearts? Maybe we feel that way sometimes, you know. Verse 18, Jesus says, also, whoever takes an oath by the altar, where they would do the sacrifices, that means nothing. That's what they were saying. But whoever takes an oath by the gift that's put on it, now that person's bound by their oath, their promise. He says, blind people, what's greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift set apart for God? So again, in their hearts and in their minds and their thinking, the animal, the meat on the altar, that outweighs the proximity to God and the closeness and the elimination of maybe the guilt and sin or the covering of that will allow people to access God. So this animal that's valuable, because in their culture, animals are currency, okay? That meat, that's more important than being close with God. And so again, their hearts are in a totally different direction. So Jesus says in verse 20, therefore the one who takes an oath by the altar takes an oath by it and everything on it. So it's not going to get you out of it just because you feel like it's less valuable. The one who takes an oath by the temple takes an oath by it and the person who dwells in it, which is God. And the one who takes an oath by heaven takes an oath by God's throne and by him who sits on it. That document that I mentioned that was made about 200 years AD, 200 years CE, after the time of Christ, here's one phrase from it. It says, if somebody administered an oath to a witness in the name of heaven and in the name of earth, these witnesses are exempt from liability for taking a false oath of testimony. So if you swear in the name of heaven or you swear in the name of earth, you're not held accountable. It's fine. But if you swear, it goes on to say, if you swear in one of the names of God, now then you're held accountable. So these are real conversations that people are having at this point in time, and Jesus is just pulling a few examples out to show where their mind is at. And ultimately, whatever is most advantageous in the moment to these people, to the leaders, that outweighs the promise that they made. And maybe sometimes we tend that way as well, as people, as humans. Whatever gives us the greatest advantage in the moment, maybe that's more important than the promises that we make to people sometimes. And so here's a question for you guys. If that was what was happening, they were basically making promises, non-binding because of technicalities, what's the better way to go about promises and oaths and giving testimony? Like, what's the higher way? If Jesus could sit in front of you and say, well, this is what was happening, but this is what I really want you to do as a community of people who are following me, what do you think he'd tell you? What would he tell you?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so if Jesus were to sit down and say, this is the way they were handling their promises, but here's how I want you to approach promises and giving testimony, what would he tell you? How should we approach it? Yes? Okay, maybe that your word is your oath. So when you speak, you speak what's true, maybe. Yeah, what else? I heard some people say, yeah.
Considering promises or oaths they could make as if you were making them to God.
Okay, so when you make a promise to a person, just see yourself as making it to God and see how serious it is. You don't have to name God's name when you make it, just realize that God hears anyway, because he's where you are.
He said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Do not swear on an oath.
Okay.
Intended.
Yeah, so let's just avoid oaths in the first place. And just when we say yes, let it mean yes. And when we say no, let it mean no, and move on. And that way people can trust you. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? I think these are all great points and different angles to consider, and that's kind of where Jesus leaves it in another conversation. There's this place called the Sermon on the Mount. That's the name that Christians have given it over the centuries, but it's Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, and Jesus is really in that kind of like condensing all of his teaching, like pulling out the heart of his teaching for how we operate as his community of followers. He's condensing it all in just a few, chapters in our Bible, basically, of content, and Matthew's putting all that together. And one of the things that Jesus says in that is, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Don't get bogged down on taking all these oaths and all these technicalities. Just be truthful, is what we might say. That's the way to really approach it. That's a solution. That's a better way. Because when you're not, and when you create technicalities, you start taking license to create all these loopholes. And that breeds lies, and it breeds injustice, and it breeds mistrust. And so just letting your yes be yes and your no be no, and considering the promises that you make as something you're making before God, these are great ways to approach the truth. And then Jesus changes. We're going to go into another area for a moment. And he starts talking about what we would call maybe tithes, and what certain translations in the Bible refer to as tithes. The word tithe, it just means a tenth, okay? And in the Old Testament, this was a concept that God brought about. Once Moses brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, he started to introduce different laws for the society, for the nation of Israel, and there were some things about giving a tenth. And maybe some of you have knowledge of that. Some of you, you just have things that you've heard. But a combination of everything. What have you heard? What do you think? What was the purpose of a tithe or giving a tenth? What have you heard about that? Or what do you think about that mixture? What might be the purpose of God asking Israel to give a tenth? What do you think? Just first thing that comes to your mind. Okay, support the people that he sent out into the world. Okay, good thoughts. Okay, and again, this is like Old Testament Israel, so pastors weren't a thing until the New Testament. But from a current perspective, yeah, if you tithe today, right? A lot of people, I think if you would poll people who were parts of churches that affiliated with Christianity, right, today, and you said, why do you tithe? Exactly what Shar said would be the answer probably a lot of times. Support pastors or missionaries or people that go out into the world. And so I think that's a very valid way, answer that people would give today. Yeah?
Well, it says anyway, and I think it blesses others.
Okay. Blessing others, that's probably a component of it. Yeah, what do you think?
Back in the day, it was for the Aaronic priesthood, the sons of Levi, that carried out the rituals and ceremonies of God. So in a way, it was to support the Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical descendants that lived by the tithings of the rest of the people, because they were dedicated and consecrated to doing rituals and ceremonies for the rest of the people on God's behalf, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So it was in a way to give to God and at the same time support the group that was in charge of making these ceremonies and rituals come to pass for them.
Yeah, exactly. He mentioned the Levites, the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother Aaron, who became the priesthood and the people that would do the physical labor around the tabernacle and later the temple in Jerusalem as well. And so they actually didn't inherit cities like the rest and land like the rest of Israel. They lived in cities, but they didn't have any land to work. And part of the reason why God set up this tenth, as you just mentioned, was to provide for them, because you have people that don't have the same resources. And it actually says in one passage, God did this intentionally. It was good for people to care for other people. Yeah?
Isn't tithe also the only place where God says to test him in this area?
That's a good thought too. Like God saying to test him and see if I won't take care of you if you don't step out and trust me in this area. So maybe it's even to create a sense of trust on our part because we're sacrificing something, right? Because if it's been a lean year and you're giving 10% of your excess crops or 10% of your crops that grow or of the animals that are born to your flocks or things like that, I mean, that could be a test of faith, right, that year. And so this is definitely a huge part of it. Another thing that's mentioned in the Old Testament in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy is that part of the reason why they were supposed to give this tenth was to care for people who were poor in their communities, not just these Levites who were doing God's work at that point in time, but also people who were from other countries who were living in their midst and might not have access to the same resources, so foreign nationals in their midst, or widows or orphans or people who circumstances of life had put into poverty. That was another reason. And then there's a third reason that I don't think we don't necessarily hear about a lot, and this is that third reason. In Deuteronomy 14, I think this is interesting, so I want to read it to you. Deuteronomy 14:22 and following, it says, each year you are to set aside a tenth of all the produce grown in your fields. You are to eat a tenth of your grain. You are to eat a tenth of your grain, new wine, and fresh oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place where he chooses to have his name dwell, so that you will always learn to fear the Lord your God. But if the distance is too great for you to carry those things to the place of the Lord your God, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, and since the Lord your God has blessed you, then exchange it for silver, take the silver in your hand, and go to the place the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the silver on anything you want, cattle, sheep, goats, wine, beer, or anything you desire. You are to feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your family. And then it goes on to talk about not neglecting the Levite, not neglecting the foreign national within your gate, not neglecting the poor, the widow, the orphan, things like that. And so it's this mixture. It's in part to care for the people who are doing God's service for their livelihood, who don't have the same inheritance that the rest of the people have physically. It's in part to care for the poor people in the midst. And it's in part to celebrate, which is something that gets really de-emphasized, I think, maybe in churches today especially. So it's all these things are the purpose of setting aside a tenth every year. And every 3 years, they were supposed to take another tenth that year and put it in a storehouse in their city to care for poor people as well. And so it was their way of caring for the needs of people and something that God orchestrated and designed. And it's interesting because the scribes and the Pharisees, they're really into this. And Jesus seems to at least point it out or grieve it. And so let's kind of process this for a moment. Verse 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." So I'm grieving your response in this way. "Hypocrites," which means actors or pretenders, people who say one thing and live another way. He says, "You pay a tenth of your mint and your dill and your cumin." So he's talking about spices, herbs. He says, you pay a tenth of that. Isn't that good? Isn't it good to give a tenth of your spices? How many of you would say, I think that's probably a good thing? How many of you would say, I think it's bad? How many of you would say, why are you even bringing that up as a question? You're trying to trick me right now, right? What's the point of that, right? What would tithing your herbs accomplish? I mean, let's think really practically. I'm going to give some salt and some pepper and some spices along with my tithe. Think about what the tithes accomplish. We just talked about that. So what would be the results of tithing herbs? What would that do for people? Somebody said very little. Okay. I'm tracking with you, perhaps. Let's see. Yeah.
It would increase the quality of their experience for the other tithings that are given. It would increase the richness of the experience.
Okay, some of you, how many of you like to add spices to your food when you cook? How many of you like completely bland food? You just love bland food. Okay, one or two of you, all right. So I spent some time about 10 years ago in Africa, and when I was there, I was in Uganda. And in the part of Uganda that I was in, there actually was a tendency for fairly plain, bland foods. It was goat meat, but not flavored with a lot of spices. It was rice or cornmeal-based doughs, bananas or plantains with very little spices. And the food, again, culturally there, that's great food. But coming from my experience here, I could have used some spices, right? Some flavor. And so when you're doing these things, you're actually enhancing the flavors of food that you're passing out to people who are maybe poor in your midst. And when you're celebrating, it's that much more enjoyable. And so maybe tithing these things wasn't a bad thing, but Jesus seems to be grieving it. So you're like, why is he grieving it? And he says next, he says, and yet, there's more, you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. So he says it was good that you tithe these herbs. Don't neglect that because there's a good purpose behind it. But you missed the more important attitudes that all of God's instruction to Israel throughout the Old Testament were meant to cultivate. The attitudes that we just talked about a moment ago. And think about that. I mean, why would God ask Israel to set aside a tenth in the first place, right? Why would he do that? Well, yes, it is to supply people's basic needs. But isn't there more to it than that? Like, think a little bit deeper on the next level. Why does God want his people to set aside a tenth? Let's just kind of dig a little deeper there. So surface level to meet people's physical needs, but what else? What's beyond that? What's deeper? Yeah, Karen.
To acknowledge that God owns all of it and that he comes first. That was supposed to be the first thing he did.
Okay, sure. To acknowledge that God is the provider of all this that you have. And so it creates that idea as well. Sure. Yeah. Why else? Why would God ask his community to give a portion of their increase? Back here and then up here.
Because I feel he has a plan and he has a will, and tenth supports his plan and his will.
Okay, so to go to furthering God's plan and God's will. Yeah, and maybe even God's form of caring for people. Yes. Sorry, I'll get back to you in a second.
I thought maybe it would be because it's like a discipline to teach you that by putting God first, whether we have abundance
Okay.
should put it on to trusting the Lord.
Sure, to grow our trust, because sometimes we have an abundance and that 10th is nothing, and then other years that 10th is sacrificing, right? It's a test of faith. Yes, sir.
Is to put in practice the liveliness of the spirit of the law. Like
Okay.
when you give a gift to somebody else, you give that gift out of gratitude, appreciation, love, and so it's that opportunity to do the same and build your relationship with God, It was a way to build a relationship with God through appreciation, through gratitude, through
Yeah.
that connection, as well.
I think that's a great observation. Yeah, why do we give gifts to people in the first place? Think about Christmas. If you give gifts to your friends or to your family members or to your kids, why do you give a gift to them, right? Why do you do that? I mean, to express your love, or maybe to express your gratitude to that person. Or for me, like one of my favorite things about Christmas is seeing my kids open up presents, because I get joy from seeing them get joy. I want them to experience joy. And these are the deeper things that giving cultivates. And I think Jesus was telling these leaders, you've got the rote motions down, like you're really good at checking off the boxes and tithing. I mean, you go through your pantry and pull out your spices and whatever, extra spices you gain from the year. You've got those things bagged and boxed and ready to take and give away, but you're missing out on the point, the attitudes that this giving is supposed to cultivate in the first place, the celebration, or the fact that you want to make life less difficult for other people, or the love that you want to express, or the gratitude through your giving, or to teach us things that are not natural to us. Kind of goes along with the discipline that you mentioned. Is it natural to sacrifice things? Not always. I mean, to give us a sense of what's just and fair in the world. And what's just and fair, our culture sometimes tells us, it's about you getting ahead. That's what's just and fair. If you're doing well, that's just and fair, at least to you. But really, we look around and we see other people suffering when we're just, rolling in the excess. It's like, is that really the way that we want to treat our neighbor, to love them as ourselves? Do we want people to experience what we're experiencing? And giving allows people to do that. Do we want to see that everyone's made in the image of God and is valuable of being cared for? Do we want to, I think you mentioned the relationships that get cultivated, or someone did as well. As you give, that creates relationship between people, right? And so all these things, not only with people like us, but with people in different financial brackets and people from different cultures in our midst, and all of this. And it just grows the community. And the Pharisees and the other religious leaders and scribes, they're missing out on the beauty of why these things were put in place in the first place, those attitudes. They're missing out on the heart transformation. We don't have time this morning to keep discussing some of that. And so I'm going to leave you with verses 24 to 28 to look at on your own time this week. I have a little bit of guidance on the back of the bulletin. There's an outline if you want to go through the rest of those verses. But Jesus kind of finishes off that conversation by talking about the exterior versus the condition of the heart. But I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts for this week based on what we've talked about already today. First of all, how should the community of God's kingdom operate with respect to the commitments that we make, the testimony that we give, even in court, the oaths and the promises that we make to people? We've had a lot of good comments, I think, about how we should approach that, but just maybe think about it a little bit more and what that means for you. How in Jesus' kingdom is that meant to operate versus how the religious leaders of Jesus' day were portraying it? Secondly, should I set aside a portion of my profits, of my increase? And that can take a lot of different forms. If so, for what purposes should I use that? And we see today it's not just for one purpose or one reason. There's a multiple different, there's a variety of approaches to what you might use surplus for. And then why? What's that really intended to do in your heart? What does God want you to experience as you take from what you have and you give to other people? It's more than just what's on the surface. And how does that differ from the way that maybe your past religious experiences or even religious leaders in your life have conditioned you to think about the truth and promises, or have conditioned you to think about giving? Because those two things might be different. And I think coming to see Jesus' perspective is very refreshing. and very freeing, and it brings about the type of life that he wants us to experience in the first place. And sometimes religion gets in the way of that. Maybe even religion or experiences you've had at this church or another church. Jesus' way is a little bit different than people's way many times.